All right, Seth, tell me about you. Where are we calling it from?
Sure. Hey, so thank you, Matei, and thank you, System2, for having me. So I am Seth Bailey. So I run our solutions engineering team here at OAG. So I am down in Richmond, Virginia. A beautifully cold day in Richmond, Virginia right now. So OAG Aviation is a aviation and airline kind of data aggregator. So we collect airline schedule data, real-time flight status data, booking information, fare information, and information on the fleets of the asset of the aircraft. Been with OAG for about 10 years. Yeah, so really happy to be here to kind of chat about how our data is used in the financial realm of the world.
Sounds great. Before we do that, I was doing a little bit of background research on this, and I came across a secret society of airline executives called the Conquistadores del Cielo.
Yeah.
Have you come across this? Is this something that you guys are part of, and how do I join?
So I can officially say OG is not part of it. I've heard the myth and lore of this secret society of airline CEOs. I don't know what the initiation process is to get into it, but I think you have to be quite senior and quite tenured at an airline, and there's probably a secret handshake and probably some sort of whiskey drink that you have to down to be part of this club. But I've heard about it. It's a secret society that somebody like myself at a lower part of the aviation data industry is unfortunately not privy to. But I have heard I'd like to be in one of those meetings to hear how they're what they're planning for the future and how the airline industry is going. But no, I've never been invited yet.
It's crazy. No, apparently they're not supposed to talk business there. They have a policy of leaving your swords at the door, and by swords
Oh,
they
okay.
mean business. Otherwise, it could just be a giant cartel that colludes to keep
It,
prices high or whatever else. But
yeah, no comment on that.
it is fascinating, and I randomly came across this. I was at some art event, and I met someone who knew someone who was like a ghostwriter on their official history. So they hired
Wow.
someone to write the history of their organization, and someone knew someone who did that. And I was like, I would love to get my hands on that book,
That
but
would be pretty cool. Probably
it
some
is
good
not
good
available
stuff
for
in there.
sale.
No, no, I don't. You're gonna find that at Barnes and Nobles anytime soon.
I know we gotta start our own secret society maybe
I'm down.
after
I'm
this
down. We
call.
can be
Yeah,
the founding members of it.
exactly. All right, tell me more about the airline macro environment. There are obviously a ton of things going on from a geopolitical standpoint. Wars. I mean, there was an article in the Wall Street Journal that showed airplanes sharing the skies with missiles, and it's getting a lot busier, a lot more dangerous out there. How is that impacting some of the things that you guys are seeing?
Yeah. So from an airline perspective, an airline data perspective, definitely the factors, economic factors, geopolitical factors have an impact on the data that we see, right? So geopolitical factors where, there's closures of airspace can, sometimes negatively impact growth of airlines, right? So if an airspace is closed and you need to fly through that airspace to reach, your destination of a new route that you want to put in, obviously you're going to think twice about putting those new routes on, right? Because you're going to spend more money on fuel. You're going to have to deal with the geopolitical issues of going in and out of getting close to the airspace that might not be so welcoming to yourself. So those different factors are definitely viewable in the data that we have, right? And they can be understood too in the growth perspective of airlines, right? Same thing with fuel prices, right? So if you see fuel prices spike or fuel prices come down, maybe there might be certain routes that are trimmed, and there might be certain routes that are passed over for shorter routes. In terms of how airlines are wanting to grow, right? So it can have a significant impact on the growth of airlines. The other thing too is, especially with fuel, you're seeing a much more, from the airline strategies, you see more orders and more preference to single aisle, kind of longer range, smaller aircraft rather than those, your Airbus A380s that are going to be eventually phased out that can take a ton of people but require a ton of fuel, right? So the preference of airlines right now, especially when fuel prices are, they're always volatile, right? But fuel is one of their biggest expense, if not their biggest. that the airlines, especially when you look at kind of like their fleet makeups and what they're planning for the future and looking at our data, they're much more focused on those single aisle, longer range aircraft that can reach, some routes that might not have been reachable by a 737 or an A320. So looking at kind of like the A321 XLRs and, hopefully eventually a replacement for the 757s for Boeing. But that's kind of the impact too, like the fueling and the closures of airspace. You can see that ripple effect in the orders and the assets the airlines are looking to take on.
How do you feel about the change to smaller aircraft, just from a personal level? I know when I've been traveling, it is weird that to now go into these very large airplanes, it feels like we got used to the small ones, but there's, in my opinion, I mean, it's so much more comfortable. They're smoother. You have more space, and now we're just getting crammed on these smaller
Yeah,
buses.
I mean, from a personal perspective, I love, like, last year I flew on Lufthansa's A380 back from Munich, and it's tough to beat that feeling, right? Like, I was up on the top deck. It was it's a special feeling, but from a unit cost perspective, it's very tough to justify those sort of aircraft, right? The fueling cost, the operating costs, the crew costs, like the labor costs associated with it, with these smaller, longer range, two engine single aisle aircraft that are super efficient. Your unit cost comes down incredibly, right? And it makes operating those aircraft more profitable. And you can open up more routes that you probably couldn't otherwise, more kind of mid-range, longer range routes that might not be available on like an A380 or even a 777 or an A330 or something like that. We've seen that with Iberia. Just started flying the A321 from Madrid to Boston, was their first A321 XLR route. And a route like that, especially in kind of like your shoulder month, like coming up to winter, it'd be tough to be profitable if it was on a 777 or if it was on an A380. But having that smaller aircraft footprint, smaller capacity number, proves that it hopefully can be a profitable venture for airlines like that. But from a personal standpoint, it's tough to beat going on the big boys on the 747s and the A380s. There's no better feeling.
Yeah. What about, okay, so speaking of getting smaller, what about the private aviation space? We have a couple of clients that have been interested in that theme, and that's the ultimate personalization, and it seems like it's becoming more popular.
Yeah, it's so as a company, OAG mainly focuses on the scheduled side of things, but we do work with a lot of FBOs and private aviation companies. You do see a shift towards private aviation is super popular, but there's also you hear these stories about just increasing costs on the private aviation side, right? So I think what's the joke in the industry? It's like the $170 turkey sandwich, right? It's just so expensive to get like the different services for the private aviation side that a lot of people they want to fly through the private side of the airport, right? Like less hassle with lines, less hassle with kind of being in the terminal, more personalization. But the cost of private aviation is continually to increase, right? And even with the I'm not super familiar with the aircrafts that are coming online, but it doesn't seem like the focus would be on cost efficiency, right? Because your Gulf Streams are still if you're going to go those long distances, like you still got to fly in the Gulf Streams, and the smaller private aviation planes you're flying more domestically or more on shorter routes are have their niche in the industry. But everything that I hear is the cost is going up. So I think cost pressure, especially on the private aviation side, is going to be is going to impact in the next for the foreseeable future, unless they kind of can get the cost structure and the cost down for actually operating these aircraft and working with these FBOs and fuel and stuff like that.
Yeah. All right, I want to get into some case studies with your data, but before we do that, I'm curious, have you come across any quirky or surprising pieces of data in when we're playing with your data sets?
Yeah. I think one thing we like doing here is finding the IATA acronyms, so like the 3-layer codes for airports that kind of spell out funny words. So one that's always come to mind is Helsinki, Finland, and their acronym is HEL for their IATA code. So essentially the guys, whenever I see them from the Helsinki airport, they always proudly say that the sign in the Helsinki airport says "Welcome to Hell." So welcome to HEL. So that's always a fun one. Then there's Sioux City, Iowa. It's SUX, so you can imagine what that spells out. And then Fukuoka, Japan is FUK. So those are three good ones that always kind of make me laugh. Another quirky, I was thinking about this the other day. It actually was came up in one of our studies. There's like the shortest scheduled flight in our database is 90 seconds. So it's a tiny hop in northern Scotland from Westray, Scotland to Papa Westray. I think it's from like a beach to the mainland, and it's literally a 90-second flight, but it's scheduled. So that's a cool one that always pops out. And then I was thinking about what they call the milk run out for United out in Guam. So there's basically in Guam and Micronesia, there's like they connect all these five or six destinations on a daily basis, where they're basically island hopping on the same, I think it's UA 154, and they call it the milk run because they're dropping off supplies for each of these destinations. But it's like six flights, and it covers over like 3,000 kilometers. But it's just like these little island hops, and that's one of the more interesting flights that I've ever come across in our database.
I love that. It's interesting because we get so used to having flights be a very particular kind of travel experience where it's regimented, you book it in advance, you go through this entire TSA process, but it doesn't have to be that, and it wasn't always like that. And you have these examples where like it sometimes makes sense to fly to get your groceries or to just get from the mainland somewhere else. And it's interesting. I remember I read an article that came out in the 1950s. It was about some futurist was talking about how in the future everyone's going to own a helicopter because it's just so convenient. It's like everyone's moving to the suburbs, people coming back from the war, buying houses in the suburbs. Like, it'd be great. Everyone just hops in their personal helicopter from the middle of nowhere, wherever you have your house, and you get into the big cities in no time. And they're surprisingly easy to fly. So there was this alternate universe where our country could have had a ton of flight infrastructure around more individualized flights like that.
Yeah, I mean that would have been a cool feature. You sometimes forget that, like, you know, I probably view it as like business and leisure. Like that's kind of like how we delineate the industry, right? But so much of aviation and so much of what a lot of airlines across the world do are providing lifelines to communities that are kind of far flung, right? Like that need pharmaceuticals, that need food, that you like, you know, up in Alaska or up in the northern parts of Canada, right? There's communities that need these you know, fruits and stuff flowing in during the winter time to make sure they're getting their vitamins, right? So it's a lot of times, you know, it's these airlines are providing a very needed utility for these communities that, you know, they have to kind of subsist on these flights and make sure that they get these, you know, life-saving and life you know, providing substances to them in these far-flung places.
I have a friend who worked at the World Bank many years ago, and she was saying that one of the crazier things she had to do was to send money to different parts of the world that needed liquidity. And it was often after some kind of natural disaster or something was going on. And she was like, we literally just took a bunch of duffel bags full of money on commercial airlines to deliver them from the World Bank to the government of some random country. And so to your point, you don't think of these additional like use cases of now in the world where everything is digital, you can send these things very quickly. But there was a time not that long ago when you were delivering suitcases of money via commercial flights to countries that really needed them.
Whoever was transporting that money, if it was your friend, I would have been so nervous. Right? Just got off.
She's it's a pretty small woman, and it was just don't think about it, don't try to draw attention to it, and hope no one takes hope you don't lose your luggage.
Yeah, right. Yeah, don't stand out. Be very bland.
Exactly. Okay, so tell me a little bit more about some of the more typical use cases that you guys see with your clients.
Yeah, so in particular to our financial clients, right, it's helping them understand how the airlines are performing, right? So the metrics in terms of you know, being able to calculate PRASM and trying to predict yield and figure out, you know, what are the you know, the financial outlooks of these airlines doing? You know, what is the atmosphere in which they're operating, right? So like understanding their ASM, so calculating their airline seat miles, so understanding like what what supply they're putting into a market, and kind of like what their network makeup is and where the different airlines cross over different networks and where the opportunities are through the schedules or through the flown flights. One thing that we also help them do is understand, okay, it's one thing to build up a market on the supply side, but from an operational perspective, how much are they actually completing those schedules, right? Are there, if you have 100 flights scheduled into a market in a month, how many of those 100 flights are they actually completing? How many are canceled? What's the operation percentage? Are they on time? Are they, what's their performance? So actually understanding the real world implications of, did that flight fly? How did it do? Was it delayed? Is it often delayed? Did it actually, what's the cancellation percentage? So the real world performance. Also helping them understand, like, what are the maybe revenue implications, but also the fares under the market. What are the offered prices that the consumer is looking at paying, right? So, how are their pricing and how are their markets changing week over week, year over year? Is flying into a particular market getting more expensive for the consumer? Is it getting more expensive for the airline? So it's really about understanding the different operating theaters that these airlines are going into and where they're looking to expand, and how their performance might become. Also, it helps them, it helps our financial clients when adverse situations occur, like how we were talking about kind of the geopolitical and the economic tides that can kind of come in. If you take COVID, right, that was created huge volatility, right? So they were grounding airplanes and, pulling routes and not flying flights or adding flights to crazy places that they thought they could, turn some revenue into during like kind of a time of crisis. So during those times of volatility, our data can kind of make sense of what's actually going on, right? Because you hear a lot of news about, okay, there's pulling all these flights, all these flights are getting canceled, this and that. But our data can actually paint you the picture of what's really going on, right? Like, how many flights are actually flying? What is the schedule actually looking like? Are they pulling those flights? What are the offered fares? Giving you a perspective of what's actually happening on a day-by-day basis in the particular market, or for the particular airline that you're focused in on. And that's one of the biggest things we do, is kind of unpack, what the story is behind the data, and help our customers understand what the what the predictive kind of analytics and what you can actually apply from the information.
Like one of the things that we're using your data for is exactly like you mentioned, is to understand scenarios. What happens as if there are mergers between airlines or some routes getting shut down? How is that going to impact pricing or availability for the other airlines that are servicing similar routes? So it's I think it's kind of interesting. You can obviously get a sense of what's happening now, but you can also do these interesting what if scenarios to understand how the industry might evolve given some hypothesis that you would have.
Yeah. Predictive intel and kind of competitive intel, especially in those mergers and acquisition situations where, one airline's being absorbed into another, and they're growing their network or adding different types of aircraft that are going to open different types of market. That can be really impactful, and having the full picture of how an airline's stacked up, like when you merge those two entities together and what they'll be utilizing, it helps you immensely kind of predict out what the airline might be doing into the future, right? So for the different, if one airline is taking on a different manufacturer's type of aircraft, and there's different, ranges of distances those aircraft can fly, different seating configurations. So maybe the newer aircraft have premium seating configurations, where that can kind of open up a new market for a different product that airline is gonna provide, which could attract a different type of customer at a different price point. So all those different types of delineations of the products and the aircrafts and the network that these airlines are flying can be telling through the information that we provide to help you kind of try and see into the future and create that hypothesis that might play out.
Talk a little bit more about the source of the data. Where do you guys get it? How do you guys get it?
Yeah, primarily the airlines are our number one source. So we have great partnerships with the airlines, and the airlines are, very, very hospitable to us accessing the data, mainly because they can then turn around and use it for their own competitive intel, right? So and many times, especially like on the flight status side, the real-time data side, that data is flowing down to maybe a third-party fueling company, a third-party baggage handling company. Because if you're like American and you're not at your DFW hub, so maybe you're up in some other different city, you might outsource that fueling or that baggage handling. And those boots on the ground, right? You want them to be as efficient as possible. So if we are providing the most accurate data to that customer, they'll ensure that the American's airplane gets serviced correctly, stays on time, is efficient, and gets onto its next flight and onto its next destination. So our airlines are our most our most critical source and the best provider of data, because it's coming directly from the horse's mouth. That's for schedules and status. For the for other data sources, governmental sources, so the FAA, swim feed is very impactful for real-time information. ADSB, satellite positional data, data feeds from other airports, other third-party networks. So if you could think of OAG as very much an aggregator of information, so we want to get as much information as possible. When you ask us a question of our data set, we can give you the most accurate information possible that you want to know about that particular airline, flight, aircraft type, whatever the data set may be. Fleet data, we partner with a company called CH Aviation, a great partner in Switzerland, that has really, really good historical aircraft data. So down to the engine type, so knowing the number of engines, knowing the manufacturer of the engines, knowing when the aircraft went online, who it was manufactured by, what's the manufacturing serial number. So really the details about the asset of the aircraft that can be woven into kind of some of our other data sets. Mainly we pump out this data through Snowflake, so you can kind of access in real time raw data format and join all of our data sets together. And then we use for our booking data set, we use a data set called MIDT, which is basically a kind of a amalgamation of Sabre, Amadeus, and Travelport data. And then we do some calibration after the month of travel to pretty much get it up to 100% of the global market on an O&D basis. And then our fare data we get mainly directly from the airlines themselves through kind of a give to get model. So we rely a lot on the airlines, and they're great partners and great customers, and we value those partnerships immensely.
I love that. I think whenever a data provider gets data directly from the horse's mouth, it tends to be, I mean, it's much more complete, it's timely, it's got a lot of advantages relative to when you have to work off of a much smaller sample of what the actual population is. So we definitely on the System2 side prefer data services that come directly from the things that we're ultimately trying to analyze.
Yeah, agreed. Same here.
What else do you think we should know about you guys, and or about just the future of the aviation data world?
Yeah, I'll say to know about OAG, right? Our goal is to provide our clients the most accurate, timely, and useful information as it pertains to any airline in the world, right? We're in the world of gathering as much information as possible, and providing it in a format in a way that you as a client can use, whether it's an API, whether it's raw data through our Snowflake, whether it's a front end GUI. We're very flexible in the way that we present our data, and we stand by the accuracy that we present. As far as data trends go, I think what we're going to be seeing into the future is more, and something that we're focused on is more predictable analytics, right? There's a lot of customers that we work with that we say, okay, I want all this data and I want to do this and that with it, but out of the box, sometimes they want some guidance in terms of predictability or usability of the data, right? So education is a really big piece of what we do when we start working with any of our clients that aren't familiar with aviation data, and to kind of fast pace that. They want more things that are kind of out of the box, ready to go. Whether it's different analytics or different ways of predictions models that we already have in house. So I think it's more going to focus around the predictive nature of our data and how it can be used in the predicting of the future. One data point that I think is going to grow in importance is SAF, so the sustainable aviation fuels. So there's a huge push on getting the airline industry more carbon conscious, essentially, right? And how do the airline industry and the aviation industry at large scale up SAF, right? Because right now traditional Jet A it's not going anywhere anytime soon, and SAF is such a small portion of what's being used by airlines. It's an additive, right? Like, you're still, even if there's SAF in an aircraft, it's still probably 99% Jet A, right? So as that grows, how is the airline, how are they going to scale that? How are we going to start making that in enough quantities where it's going to make a big difference in terms of carbon output, and being more green as an industry? But also, how do we keep that cost in check? So, SAF is a great idea, but if it comes with additional costs and higher costs, how are airlines gonna, they're just gonna pass that off to the consumer? They're already working on pretty razor thin margins. So additional cost is not something that the airlines want to hear about, right? So it's got to be kind of waiting of how do we scale it up, and then how do we, how does the industry get it at a competitive cost? And I think that's going to be a focused data point into the future.
Really cool. And you guys have visibility into that breakdown?
A little bit here and there. So we calculate emissions. So we have an emissions model. And the problems with the emissions model right now, as it pertains to SAF, is just such a tiny piece that it doesn't have a massive impact. But we have to plan for the future, right, of SAF becoming more and more impactful in those modelings, right, to understand how SAF is actually playing a part in decreasing carbon emissions, right? Because that's essentially the goal of SAF, right? So we're going to be focusing in on that in the future of understanding, okay, as the quantity of SAF grows into into the airline space and the aviation space, how do we then kind of change our models and have our models reflect that SAF is having an impact? I think it's going to take a long time for that, to kind of take hold, but it's certainly where the industry is going and something that we need to plan for.
Cool. All right, last question. Do you remember your first flight?
Oh man, I know. So when I was, I think 5, I remember this a little bit. I was 5, and my grandfather, who traveled a lot for business, he worked for Sylvania, the light bulb company, Osram Sylvania, and he somehow back in 1990, what would it have been, 91, was able to take like 20 people on all his airline points from Boston to Hawaii. I can't remember the aircraft type, but I remember bits and pieces of that flight. Going from, I don't think it was direct. I think we had to fly to LAX and LAX to Honolulu, but we also did puddle jumpers in like intra island, and I got a really bad ear infection. And one of the puddle jumpers, I think from Honolulu to either Kauai or Maui, I had just like blistering pain, and my mom said that I screamed the whole time that 15-minute flight. So, and I do remember that. So that is like my first memory of being on like a real flight, which is interesting now that I work in aviation and I love flying. That was like my first real memory of flying. You think I'd go the opposite way, but I guess I leaned into the experience.
That is an intense first flight. It's
like when it's a core memory that's burned into my brain.
Yeah, it's a bunch of layovers, puddle jumpers, ear infections. Man, that's
but still the best part of that whole situation is that my grandfather was able to take on airline points back in 1991 like 20 people from Boston to like, you can't, like, that is, I can't even think of the cost of that right now. Like in terms of airline points, it would be astronomical.
I can't even think of 20 people I would invite.
It was wild. It was like it was the whole side of my mom's family. It was crazy. It was absolutely crazy that he could do something like that. It was pretty cool.
Even that, honestly, it's such a, even with family, right? To organize, to get 20 people's schedules to align, to drop things, to go on something like that. I think it also speaks to how special that was to be able to go on a trip like that where people were willing to drop other things that going on in their lives, but like, oh yeah, it's totally worth going to Hawaii on this trip.
Yeah, and it's still in my family, still talked about a lot because there's just a lot of like good memories from that, and ear infections in my memory. But no, it was very, very cool. And maybe it's just the trip itself, right? The idea that you could go that far maybe imprinted that, all right, this is a really cool industry. Maybe I want to pursue it.
An awesome origin story.
Yeah.
Thanks for sharing it.
Yeah, no problem. My pleasure.
Awesome, Seth. Well, it was really nice to chat with you about this.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me. And I enjoyed the conversation, and always happy to chat about aviation.
Awesome. Well, now people know where to go to if they have any kind of aviation questions.
Yep. Go to oag.com.
Perfect.